Poor Joe. How in the world did this guy, right on the verge of success, end up like that? Well, it actually started at birth, but it began to get serious when his father scraped together enough change to send Joe and his twin brother Calvin to town for a movie to celebrate their 12th birthday. A matinee at the Grand Marquis in Natchez was the next best thing to Christmas as far as Joe and Calvin were concerned, and almost as rare. They both loved war stories and Warner Brothers gangster films, starring a lineup of actors known as Murderers Row. On the big silver screen of the Grand Marquis, Edward G. Robinson, James Cagney, Paul Muni, and Humphrey Bogart took turns killing each other in eye-popping mob-themed motion pictures like Little Caesar and The Public Enemy. But today's feature had an added attraction, a Joe Louis newsreel. As the other boys ran into the theater, Joe remained on the other side of the street with his hands in his pockets, pacing and kicking a stone along the gutter. "Y'all go ahead," he called. "I'll come in a minute." Calvin took a slap at the air. "Who cares about Joe anyhow?" he said. "Let's go on in." After the boys paid their admission and ran into the theater, Joe ambled over to the ticket booth and slid a quarter through the opening at the bottom of the glass. "One, please." The white woman inside pushed her eyeglasses up on her nose and smiled. "Well, ain't you handsome? Where'd you get them pretty gray eyes, sugar? Your mama or your daddy?" Joe stared at her a moment and then grinned. "My daddy. Mama's eyes are blue." She slipped his ticket and change under the window. "Enjoy the show, honey." Joe stepped inside and scowled at the colored section sign, the Mason-Dixon line for Negro theater goers. On an impulse, he pulled his cap low on his face and hurried past the usher. When he slid into a seat, he smiled. He couldn't believe that he was in the white section and no one had stopped him. Then 4 white children hurried into the row, 3 boys and a girl who looked 10 or 11. The girl smoothed her pink dress and took the seat next to him. "Hi," she said. Joe squirmed and smiled back at her. "Hi. My brother hates it when I tag along, but I don't care. I love the picture show." "Me too," Joe said as he watched the girl's fingers entwining her blonde pigtail. The lights dimmed as the newsreel started, but then the picture froze and the house lights blazed on. The audience buzzed, but the usher's voice cut through the noise. "Hey, you!" He pointed at Joe and gave him a disdainful up and down look. "Your brother's looking for you." Joe's knees were shaking as he stood up. When he reached the aisle, the usher grabbed him by the collar. "Oh, one of them high yellow ones, huh? You know the colored section's up in the balcony. You stay where you belong next time. Hear me, boy?" Joe heard the blonde girl gasp as he ran out, and all around him was derisive laughter. When he reached the lobby, the usher slammed the doors, and Joe heard the slurring of the newsreel restarting. Fighting tears, he hurried to the exit, but stopped when he saw his brother. Calvin was grinning at him from the bottom of the balcony steps, his elbow resting on the colored section sign. "Happy birthday, sunshine," he sneered. "You sweet little yellow pansy." Joe smirked and headed up the stairs. "So what if you squealed? I passed for white." "You ain't passed for long, you damn crybaby," Calvin said, pushing ahead of him on the stairs. "And you ain't never going to. Not long as I'm around. And I ain't going no place." And things didn't get any better as Calvin and Joe grew up. Calvin dreamed of being the next Joe Louis while his brother gravitated toward music. Joe was already the star soloist in the church choir, but after hearing Tommy Dorsey's new singer, Frank Sinatra, on the radio, Joe's gospel singing turned into a burning ambition to croon in New York City. But through it all, the fights continued. Joe's practiced indifference was his only weapon against his brother. No matter how severe the beating, he dusted himself off and infuriated Calvin with a cavalier grin. He had always heard that a light complexion was supposed to be the most valuable asset a colored person could possess. But he knew better. Joe hated the term light, bright, and damn near white. The hard truth about being light-skinned was that damn near was still damn far. He had seen too many damn nears laboring their lives away, just like his father and all the other darker Negroes in the cotton fields. As summer approached, he dreamed up excuses to avoid field work and settled on a mysterious heat-induced illness. Once, for effect, he even forced himself to throw up, and the ploy worked. While Calvin worked in the fields alongside his father, Joe's mother insisted that he remain indoors. At the end of June, he peered at his pale reflection in the mirror with a new certainty. He was no longer a damn near. Joe Bailey was as white as most of the white folks in Meade County. That summer, their father died suddenly, and after a few years, things became deadly. One last fight changed both boys' lives and catapulted them, ready or not, into manhood. Joe disappeared, and Calvin was convicted for his murder. As you probably guessed, Joe was not dead. Joe turned up very much alive in New York City. Passing as a white man was easier and more glamorous than he had ever dreamed. He was hired as a vocalist by a hot bebop band on 52nd Street, met a studio violinist named Magda, and fell in love. Living the dream. What happened to Calvin, you ask? Well, it took 4 hard years of prison for something good to finally happen to Calvin. Calvin Bailey was the only one dressed and waiting for the guard that morning when the bell rang. Since his mother's death, there had been no fluctuations in his daily routine. Field work, 3 squares, no visits, no mail. He paced impatiently in the small confines of his cell until the guard finally unlocked the door. "You got a visitor, Bailey." Calvin shook his head. "Must be a mistake." "No mistake, convict, come on." The guard took him through a series of security doors, then Calvin sat down at the table for non-contact visits. As he stared through the thick wire mesh, he wondered who would sit in the chair across from him. After a minute, a tall, slender Negro Calvin had never seen before sat down. He wore a dark blue suit and a matching fedora, which he removed to run a hand over his salt and pepper hair. Calvin blinked at him wordlessly and then stood up to leave. "Wait," the stranger said. "Please, are you Mr. Calvin Bailey?" "No, I'm Mr. 87439, but all my society friends just call me convict." "Please, Mr. Bailey, you are Mr. Bailey." "Look, who the hell are you? You ain't on my visitors list because I ain't got one." "My name is Ezekiel Templeton. I'm a lawyer and I got a special pass to see you." Calvin laughed bitterly and moved away from the table. "Please," Templeton said, "I'm not like your trial lawyer. I can guarantee you that." Calvin looked at him. "No, you ain't like that, sissy. You got the extra handicap of being a nigger." Templeton held up a hand. "Please, Mr. Bailey, 5 minutes." Calvin studied him for a moment, then slumped back into the chair. "What do you want?" "I'm here to help you if you'll let me. I'm pretty sure I can get you out of here." "What you got? A shotgun down your pants leg? Because that's the only way my ass gets out of here." Templeton leaned forward and stared into his eyes. "I know you didn't kill your brother." Calvin felt a slight catch in his breathing. "How you know that?" "Because nobody killed him. He's alive." Calvin froze. For 4 years, he had known somewhere deep inside that Joe was alive, but hearing the actual words from this stranger was a jolt. "You've seen him?" "I was working on a murder case and no one had found a corpse. The prosecuting attorney was going after my client like he'd found the body himself and was ready to present it as Exhibit A. So I started checking case law and came across your trial. When I read that you'd been convicted, I started investigating and I found the newspaper photos of you and your brother, and I had to find out what really happened to Joe." "Why the hell you think I ain't killed him?" "A feeling. But then I found this." Templeton unfolded a newspaper clipping and held it up. Calvin stared at the grainy photo of a 6-piece band above the words, "Hear the hip sounds of Beat the Heat," appearing nightly at Rhythm Nocturne. Calvin's eyes were drawn to the man in the center. The straight hair and fancy suit made him look older and more polished than sophisticated, but there was no doubt in Calvin's mind. The white man in the photo was his brother, Joe. Meanwhile, back in New York, after 2 months, Joe had settled into his new life as a band singer. At times, he still felt like an outsider, but continued to observe the other musicians. They were like 5 fingers on one artistic hand, united by their reverence of a music that was impossibly mathematical, carnal, and spiritual all at the same time. An enigma not unlike Doc Calhoun. Over time, Joe had acquired an intense craving for that ethereal late-night world of time that Doc called the witching hour. The last set was instrumental improvisation, which freed Joe to sit and listen and learn. The other band members shook off the alcoholic cobwebs of too many Scotch rocks, then followed Doc like apostles into uncharted musical territory. Complex riffs and unexpected chord progressions floated on cigarette smoke and soft sighs of holy Jesus. And Joe realized that he was like all the others. Like it or not, He was moth to Doc Calhoun's flame. The crowd usually thinned out early on Sundays and Mondays, but the show always went on for the loyal handful of bleary-eyed diehards who waited patiently in the fog of stale cigarette smoke for Doc's last number. As the witching hour began, the waitresses cleared the empty tables and Joe studied Doc, fascinated by his nightly ritual, his palms pressing their moisture into the folds of his handkerchief before picking up the horn, the repetitive licking and pursing of his lips in preparation, the deliberate adjustment to settle the mouthpiece into the perfect position, the expansion of his chest as he filled his lungs with the rarefied kind of air that seemed to know it was fated to be music. Spotlight. His left shoulder dropped slightly, then he turned and stared at Joe with eyes full of conversation. Jazz tells stories, Junior. Listen. The next evening, Joe tried to catch a nap before the show, but lately sleep had been a stranger. He turned on the radio and stretched out in bed. Johnny Dollar was in mid-episode, and the droning voices quickly lulled him to sleep. But after dozing a while, he woke up to the beginning of a special report. This just in regarding the recent suicide of Secretary of Defense Vincent Forrestal. Authorities have now released an unfinished note found in Forrestal's room at Bethesda Medical Hospital. No quiet murmur like the tremulous wail of the lone bird, the carolus nightingale. When asked to comment on the note's meaning, Senator Joseph McCarthy stated his belief that it was the communists who hounded Forrestal to his death. And now a word from our sponsor, Alka-Seltzer. Joe sighed. Lately, there was just no escaping the Red Scare. McCarthy and his gavel-pounding HUAC committee seemed to hound those pathetic witnesses around the clock. The radio and the front page of every newspaper screamed indictments on the creeping evil of communism, with an occasional dissenter arguing the case for the First Amendment. Zig and King had tried to explain it to Joe by telling him about the people they called the hunted ones. Writers and fellow musicians who had fled to Europe or Mexico, overnight expatriates whose refusal to name names had ended their careers, divided their families, and driven more than a few to suicide. Some had faced McCarthy's Un-American Activities Committee to answer un-American questions about their private thoughts and beliefs, the people they knew, where they had come from. Are you now, or have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party? Each time Joe heard the question, it was a mental pinprick that bled into a messy, vivid picture of what would happen to him if someone dug into his past. Are you now, or have you ever been, a Negro? And Joe realized that he knew those people, the hunted ones, those people whose names appeared on an ominous document, real or mythical, simply called the Blacklist. He stared at the radio and wondered which side had hunted Forrestal into that corner where there was nothing left for him but an unfinished poem and a 16-story leap. Had he been one of the hunters or one of the hunted? Perhaps he had been both. Now, things were about to get real gritty for Joe. He just didn't know it yet. Things came to a head one night after the show. The band members had gone to an all-night automat, and after a late meal of pie and coffee, the others had drifted on out to go home. The only ones left at the table were Joe and Doc.